Welcome to this session on trauma-informed principles. She'e Veronica Waleto Decrane Yanishya, Hawan Tlanen Ishlin, I Kirina Bashichin, Twitch ini Dashanele, Tratnesani Dashache. Tej Bitwat Nasha, Do Billings, Montana de Kajde. Hello, everyone. I'm Veronica Waleto Decrane. I'm Dene. I'm from the Mini Hogans clan and born for the Mexican clan. And I am joining you all from Billings, Montana, where I live. I'm a training and technical assistance manager with the National Native Children's Trauma Center, which is based at the University of Montana. And I grew up in New Mexico in a small community on our reservation there. And I've just been really passionate about this work of trauma-informed care because just growing up knowing how helpful this was in certain aspects when it was being used in schools and in my community and in my family, and then how unhelpful it was when these principles were not being used. So I'm excited to share with you today about trauma-informed principles. And maybe you're coming to this session already familiar with trauma-informed care. Maybe you're trying to learn a little bit more about it. Maybe you're trying to figure out what it actually looks like for schools. So this will be an introductory session into trauma-informed care and just taking a look at some of the guiding principles that kind of help determine practices that will support children who are impacted by trauma. So just to tell you a little bit of the National Native Children's Trauma Center, it's our mission to co-facilitate trauma-focused healing for Native children, families, and communities. And we hope to do that with understanding, respect, and honoring of tribal sovereignty, and really looking at the specific needs of each community that we partner with, and also honoring the use of traditional ways of healing. So we work with any type of agency or organization that interacts with tribal youth. So that includes school systems, as well as other types of systems like juvenile justice, child welfare, health organizations, health clinics. So any type of agency or organization that would impact the life of tribal children, the lives of tribal children. So the objectives that I'm hoping would be useful to you all today is to really, we're going to dive into the SAMHSA's concept of a trauma-informed approach. So you'll see that in the handouts, the title of that in the handouts. And we're really going to look at 4 assumptions that are in this document. One of the 4 assumptions are also referred to as the 4 R's of a trauma-informed program, organization, or system. We're also going to look at the 6 key principles that really guide an organization to being trauma-informed. And we're going to look at some of the practices that are specific to schools that align with these principles. And then hopefully during this time, you'll have an opportunity to reflect on each of those principles and to look at maybe your own school setting, your own organization, and how it aligns with these principles. And maybe you can see where you're doing very well and where you're really implementing some of these principles within your schools. And then maybe you might see some ways in which you really want to hone in on and improve and shore up some of the things that you already do. So we're going to start off by watching a video, and the link to that video is on the screen, but we'll also be sharing it in the chat. So if you'll give me a second, I will go ahead and pull that up for us.
A Correspondent Candid with Oprah Winfrey.
Oprah, your story for 60 Minutes this week is about childhood trauma. And there's a lot of new science here about trauma-informed care. For anyone who's dealing with a traumatized child, what can they learn from your story?
Well, I think that this story is it is my hope that our story on trauma-informed care will not just be impactful, but will also be revolutionary. It certainly has caused a revolution in my own life. And I was struck by the story because it reminded me of my own childhood growing up in Milwaukee. It's not lost on me, the irony of being back in the same city, Milwaukee, where I grew up on welfare, poor, a lot of negative experiences, sexual abuse and all of that. What's the difference between a really bad childhood and being able to overcome that and a traumatic childhood and someone not being able to overcome that?
Really, it boils down to something pretty simple.
And the answer that Dr. Bruce Perry gives you is relationships.
If you also have opportunities to be connected to people in positive ways, that can buffer some of those effects. And as you get older,
I'd like to know more about that.
What he really means is love. He's a scientist, he's not going to use the word love, but it really is about how you are responded to, valued, trusted, and loved by those around you. So I didn't get it from the people who I felt I should have gotten it from. It can be anybody who cares enough about you to ask the question, what happened to you?
Could you trace back in your mind, it was that person who made the
I know
difference?
exactly who did it. I know exactly the moment I started to feel valued, and for me, it was school.
I wanted to be a fourth grade teacher because of Mrs. Duncan. And I haven't seen Mrs. Duncan since then, and Mrs. Duncan is here today. Mrs. Duncan!
The moment I felt the most value was in my fourth grade class when Mrs. Duncan said to me, I was the one who was chosen to lead the class and whatever it was.
So what was that like? I don't really remember. I do remember you.
I remember you were such a fluent reader.
Well,
if I had a class full of students like Oprah, I would have been floating on air.
Mrs. Duncan instilled in me this sense of believing that I mattered. And that is what every human being is looking for.
when you first heard that I had done something in life, did you know that it was me?
Yes, I kept up with you without your being aware of it.
And it was Mrs. Duncan who helped heal you?
For me, yes. It was Mrs. Duncan, and then it was my sixth grade teacher, Mr. Graham. It was school that made me feel a sense of value and connection.
You learned a lot on this story.
Oh, I learned a lot on this story. This story was life-changing for me.
Life-changing, really.
Life-changing. And people use that word rhetorically. Life-changing. It's changed the way I operate in my business, with my people, with my school. 1, 2, 3. You say that the most important question to ask of people who have gone through trauma is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
yeah.
Yeah. So when you see, a church being shot up, or you see, all of the headline making stories of people seemingly gone mad, your first thought is, what happened to that person?
Right.
Right. You know, what has been life changing for me is the question, what happened to you? Not what is wrong with you, but what happened to you? Which is an important question, not just for people who have been so-called traumatized, but it's the most important question you can ask of anyone. I can say that of all the stories I've ever done in my life and all of the experiences I've ever had and people I've interviewed, this story has had more impact on me than practically anything I've ever done.
It's changed the way you see everyone?
It's changed the way I see everyone. So when I have an employee who is acting out of line or who is just being a jerk, I don't think, what's wrong with that guy? What's wrong with that girl? What's wrong with that person? I think, I wonder what happened to them. I wonder what happened to them. I wonder what happened that caused them to behave that way. That's what this story did for me.
All right. Give me a second while I pull up the slides. And while you're waiting, if you could share in just your thoughts about what came to mind, what struck you, what stood out to you in watching this video, especially as we asked the question, what is trauma-informed care? So go ahead and respond to that.
And Veronica, you already have your first response. Natalie in Utah sharing, I love that, and in quotations, the what happened to you. So asking that question.
Yes, I think that's pivotal to what it is that we're hoping to achieve when we're trying to provide care that is informed by our understanding of what trauma is and how it impacts individuals.
Yeah, and Shannon in South Dakota was echoing the same thing, that she really likes that question of, well, I wonder what happened to you.
Yes. One of the things that I'm hoping was really highlighted for you in this video is that trauma-informed care is a mindset. So it's that shift that she's talking about from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So one of the things that I think is very difficult for us sometimes with trauma-informed care that I've noticed with myself, as well as just supporting others in this work, is that there's no program, there's no set program, there's no prepackaged program, there's no prescribed set of practices. There are practices that research has shown are effective, and there's evidence around their effectiveness. But one of the things that Oprah talks about as she learned about what trauma-informed care is that it's how we love, right? And in our Indigenous communities, we can really understand that, right? Sometimes things are very highly made academic. These terms are made academic or they are made scientific. But in our Indigenous communities, we understand relationships and we understand love. And so it's the relationships, it's the environment, it's the culture that is built that really reverberates throughout the entire organization because of a shared mindset that everyone in that organization shares. So I hope that's something that you were able to take away from that.
Yeah, and you had a few more comments. Things like, it's all about looking at each other through a new lens and understanding the power of caring and connected relationships. The next one is, I bet if we asked that question, people would feel more compassion and hopefully be more open to talking and solving things instead of continuing to fall into negative patterns. Then what struck me most was Oprah was still emotional about how this woman affected her life. The next one, the importance of mattering and how love buffers trauma. This clip connected to Bettina Love's ideas in We Want to Do More Than Survive. Trauma can follow you for a lifetime. Teachers who understand how trauma affects students can be a huge part of overcoming trauma. Conversely, not understanding the effects of trauma can further traumatize. And then let's see, it's about looking at each other through a different lens and the power of caring and connected relationships. Camille saying it reminds her of her aunties asking what happened to you when she missed a dinner or gathering. They meant that they missed me and wanted to acknowledge that they knew what happened to keep me away must have been significant. I like that trauma-informed practices shift away from the deficit model of education. And then the last two, what always strikes a chord within the heart is I hope all teachers learn and practice trauma-informed care, as it often teachers that make that connection and change with our students. And then so true when asked what's wrong with you implies not able to function physically, mentally. I love the shift.
Wow. I'm glad you guys, I'm glad that video really resonated with you, because it did with me too. And one of the thoughts that you all brought up is the teacher, right? The teacher in Oprah's life that even after all those years still had an impact. And it wasn't really about what she taught her in terms of the lessons that she was teaching, that she was learning in her classroom, but it was about how she felt, how that teacher made her feel, right? So that's so key to what we're talking about when we are talking about trauma-informed care. And so we're now going to talk about trauma-informed organizations. Like, what does it really take for an organization to really carry out this mindset, to really show compassion and love and all these things that we know are good for all human beings, but also especially important for those ones that have been hurt. And so in the handout that I shared, these principles that we're going to talk about today really start with the 4 R's. And it's something that trauma survivors, trauma practitioners, and trauma researchers came together and really considered what it makes a trauma-informed organization. And so they came up with these 4 R's. The first one is realizing the widespread impact of trauma. Knowing that 1 in 4 children in the US will experience a traumatic event before the age of 16. And understanding potential paths for recovery. So really accepting and believing and understanding that healing from trauma is possible for everyone. The second R is recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others that are involved with the system. So knowing that trauma impacts students and staff physically, mentally, emotionally, and socially and spiritually. And that oftentimes we see the signs of trauma's impact on individuals by their behavior. And the third R is responding. So a trauma-informed organization responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So we know that trauma-informed care is about love and compassion, but that really is held up and really lived out when we integrate that throughout everything that the organization stands for and does. So those policies, those daily practices, those yearly practices, those procedures. So those are the things where we actually start to see it showing up on a daily basis for not just the students and staff, but also for families as well. So we can look at things like individual practices, group-based interventions, classroom-based practices, school-wide practices, practices that are internal and external. So not forgetting the families and communities. And so those things are in place to allow healing to happen, but they're also important when we don't know if someone is hurt, when we don't know if someone is suffering. It's creating that culture and environment so that anybody, no matter whether you're, traumatized or not, as Oprah said, it still is a good way to treat one another. It's a good way to do business. And then the last R is resisting re-traumatization. So a trauma-informed organization tries not to traumatize individuals again, right? Tries not to be the source of that trauma, the cause of that trauma. So while a student's traumatic experience may come from outside of the school environments and how adults and peers respond to students can make it worse and can add to their traumatic experiences. So we're going to go through 6 principles that are listed in that handout. First one is safety, trustworthy and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues, or as I like to call it, equity and social justice. So the first one we're going to look at is safety. So what we know about trauma is that it's an experience a person has that threatens their safety or the safety of their loved ones or of their community. So the key to this is the experience. For those of you who have some foundational knowledge around trauma and how it's defined and how it's determined, it's really that experience that a person has, their perception of that experience. So 2 people might go through the same event, the same car accident, the same pandemic, but their experience might vary. One person might feel like their life was threatened or that the life of others in the car were threatened, but the other person may not have experienced it as a threat. A trauma-informed school works to first establish and maintain a sense of safety for everyone, knowing that safety is so key. And a trauma-informed school must also restore a sense of safety for those who may be experiencing traumatic stress. So sometimes we know, right, if a person is really struggling with a traumatic experience. We often assume that because a traumatic event happened, that everybody is struggling with it in the same way. But there may be some individuals who really suffer and struggle more long-term. And so some of the ways in which we respond to them is really to help them restore that feeling of safety for themselves. Even though that event is over, or even though there's no real or direct threat to them, immediate threat, they may still feel unsafe. That feeling of threat may be continuing and continuous for them. But then we might also realize that there may be some people who are not struggling with that traumatic event as we think they should be, or as we think that they would. And so trauma-informed organizations really help everyone, whether they're feeling threatened in the moment or at the time or not, to really feel a sense of safety. So it's about establishing it It's about maintaining that safety, and it's also about restoring it. And it's really the staff and those that we serve within our schools that determine whether or not they feel safe. So we can't decide that for them. We can't say we did X, Y, and Z and they're safe. They have to feel safe themselves. They have to determine that they feel safe and that they are safe. So it's that felt safety that's really important. So I'm just going to give you one example of creating safety. Of course, relationships are really key to helping those within our schools feel safe, but it's also important that their environment feels safe. So a child can feel safe when they can turn off their alarm system and let their guard down. And that's what predictable and consistent routines do for them. So trauma is often associated with chaos and loss of control. Having clearly defined and predictable routines, procedures, schedules, like the one you see on the screen, it really helps a child to reduce the fear of the unknown, and it can help them decrease their stress. The more consistency and predictability that we can provide within the environment, the greater sense of safety children will experience. Then they can relax, they can put their focus and energy on things like socializing with their peers, playing, learning. And then if there are changes to routines, it's important for us to give students that heads up. So this is just one practice that can help to establish routine and has been proven to be effective in establishing safety and has been proven to be effective. Maybe you guys have some of your own examples, things that you do in your schools to increase a sense of safety for students, to establish that sense of safety, whether it's physical safety, social safety, psychological safety, safety within their academics, safe to be who they are, their identity. So go ahead and share what some of those examples are that maybe you already do within your school. Sarah, do we got any responses yet?
Yeah, I see some typing. There we go. So our first response, social safety, primary caregiving. Ensuring that when I'm in the classroom, I behave in emotionally steady ways so that my students can trust that my responses will be calm.
Great example, that calm affect.
And we are working on a safe, calm room right now where we hope to have trained individuals to help with moments where students need a moment of peace. And then I've been thinking recently about what a safe space means. Safe for who? Is my perception of what I think is a safe space meeting the needs of someone else?
Great question. Go ahead and keep adding your thoughts in the chat. Feel free to respond to one another. And hopefully you guys are able to share ideas with each other, what's working, what's not working, and continue to pose those important questions about how do we go about establishing a sense of safety. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next principle, trustworthiness and transparency. So many of the traumatic experiences that a person might go through often happens within their family unit or within their close relationships. And the trust that should have been the basis of these relationships are broken, resulting in the traumatized person developing attachment issues. So these attachment difficulties can look like a person becoming more suspicious. It can look like a person having unhealthy boundaries, social isolation, trouble asking for help, being uncertain about the reliability and predictability of relationships. So knowing the impact of the loss of trust that happens because of traumatic experiences, trauma-informed schools will make trustworthiness and transparency a priority. They'll do this by building healthy connections and maintaining those healthy connections and restoring healthy connections when trust has been broken. Sometimes it's the school itself that is where the source of that broken relationship is. So it's not just what happens in their families, in their communities, with their peers. It could also be what happens between a student and a teacher, a student and a principal, a student and some other staff member. So trustworthy and transparency is demonstrated through all operations and decisions that the school makes. So one of the ways that really being forthright upfront about how you're operating and how you're making decisions is part of that transparency, developing that transparency, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's school-wide, if it's with your own staff or if it's with your students or with families or with the community. So it's just making sure that we're building that trust, we're building those healthy connections with everything throughout our whole organization, with everything that we do and how we operate. So one way trustworthiness and transparency is demonstrated is in our attunement, particularly if we're thinking about attunement to students. So this is a video that I'm going to show you that demonstrates the importance of healthy attachments and relationships through attunement. So give me a second while I pull that video up.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
All right, your thoughts, share your thoughts in the chat. Let me know what this video brought to mind for you in terms of attunement. While
So I
pull up the
read,
slides.
starting at the beginning, by the time you were 15, that you were already had lived.
And folks are typing. I'm just waiting for the responses to appear.
Okay.
So the first comment, I studied a lot of this in college. It's amazing what children, even babies, can pick up on. It just reminds me how critical the early formative years are. It was heartbreaking to watch when she disengaged for the 2 minutes. I know that little cry.
Mhm.
It must have been hard for that mama. It hurt me.
Right.
What is unique to us as Indigenous families? What about the critical importance of prenatal and breastfeeding?
Mhm. So attunement happens so early, right? So early. And it continues to be critical as the child grows. So it's still a critical piece, even if the child is at the age as a young person in the picture, maybe a high school student. Attunement is still important. You know, it's really about reacting appropriately to another person's emotions and moods. And we see, that parent demonstrate that it's all about detecting what their children are feeling and thinking, even if it's not expressed verbally. So even when our students don't express things to us verbally, we can still read their body language, right? We can still kind of sense their moods. So it's just as important for school staff as it is for parents. I remember an experience where I was doing an observation in a classroom, and sometimes, as school staff, we don't realize that we are not practicing attunement, we're not doing it on purpose. But as I was observing this classroom, I noticed that one of the students was crying and started crying. I didn't know what the reason was that student was crying, and the teacher was really focused on the lesson and was already responding to certain students that were answering her questions, and she didn't notice that the student was crying. The other student was crying. So sometimes we don't realize that, right? We're not paying attention, even as parents, right? We're on our phones or we're doing something and we're distracted and not paying attention. But what's important in this video that I hope you were able to take away from it is that, you know, even when there are experiences that cause stress to children and to our students because of an adult not being attuned to them, that can be repaired. So attunement is just one example of building trust, and that can happen within relationships. So I'm going to move us along to the next principle, which is peer support. So peer supports help establish safety and hope. They build trust, they enhance collaboration, they utilize personal stories and lived experiences to promote recovery and healing. This can happen between one student and another. It can happen between one staff and another. It can happen between, you know, one parent or caregiver and another. It can happen within a group. It can be an informal thing that happens, a formal thing with a structure. You know, it can be some of that tier 2 intervention, those support groups that we create, or it can be just two folks getting together and talking about and sharing their experiences that they share. So this peer support relationship that happens between individuals is really based on mutual respect. It's based on empathy and on having an equal ground. So for the topic that we're talking about, trauma-informed care, this often means that the peer that we're talking about are individuals that have lived experiences of trauma. They're trauma survivors, and they're able to build that relationship with others who have that same lived experience or similar experiences of trauma. So just think about maybe some things that you do in your school to really help peers build those relationships. And one of the examples that I'm going to share, you know, you might consider this formal, you might consider this an informal. It's definitely one of those practices that has some evidence of effectiveness around it. It's definitely rooted in Indigenous perspectives and worldview and ways. And so talking circles is just one of those examples. It's a structured time and space to check in, to share feelings, to discuss issues, to learn from one another. Maybe some of you are doing this with students. Maybe you're doing this at staff meetings. Maybe you're having family talking circles, community talking circles. So the format really is different, but one of the common ways that this occurs is, you know, there's a talking piece that is passed around. Everyone listens, but one person that has that talking piece is speaking. And it's done usually in a circular format, although nowadays you also see a lot of virtual talking circles happening. So you can structure it by alphabetically or assigning people a number when you're doing it in a virtual space. Maybe some of you have experience with talking circles, and you're welcome to share what that experience has been, if it's been impactful to those that have been involved in it. Are there any talking circles that you've done that maybe involve trauma survivors? Really was a support group, maybe even for those who are struggling with trauma. So feel free to share any of that in the chat. So the next principle I'm going to talk about is collaboration and mutuality. So one of the things that often happens when people experience trauma is that it's as a result of abuse of power. And so people have the opportunity to heal when that occurs, when there's leveling of that power imbalance. So a trauma-informed school may prioritize collaboration and mutuality as a way to level out some of those power imbalances. And ways in which this happens is we develop these partnerships, whether internally, externally, and through these partnerships, we work in collaboration with our partners, and we work towards goals that are mutually beneficial, not just beneficial for the school or the adults, or the professional, the person with the professional role, but is beneficial for all the partners involved. And what's key to this is that every individual, regardless of their role or status in the school or in society, is being shown that they are valued. So one of the opportunities that I had a chance to be a part of in Montana, I was able to work on a project in which we helped some schools implement the parent-teacher home visit project. And so this is just one of the practices I'll highlight, because I just really feel like it was such a great example of just that leveling of the power imbalances. So the project that I was a part of, teachers were given a choice to participate, and they called, they got in touch with caregivers and family members, and they set up these visits that were scheduled, and where the families knew that the teacher was going to come to their school or to their home or to some other place that that family member or that caregiver chose. So in some cases, it was their home, if they felt comfortable enough for the teacher to come to their home. In other cases, it was at the McDonald's or some other place where they felt comfortable meeting with that teacher. But the point was that it wouldn't be at the school. And the reason for that was the focus on leveling the power imbalances, because there were sometimes, we know parents don't always feel comfortable coming to parent-teacher conferences, and they don't always feel comfortable walking into a classroom of a teacher and they may feel a little bit powerless or like they're out of their element when they do that. So that was a purposeful aspect to that project. And then the focus was really on building relationships and getting to know the parent, the caregiver, the family. And so versus like in previous experiences for those schools, they were actually doing home visits because someone was truant, a student was truant, or there were some behavioral issues happening or academic issues happening. And so that's why they would make those home visits. But the focus of these visits were to build relationship. So there was no forms or things to fill out. There was no, issues to talk about. It was just a way to get to know families. So that was just one example of collaboration that I know was pretty effective for these schools. I don't know if some of you guys have experienced these kinds of home visits before, or if there's other ways that you've collaborated with families, with community partners even, and what that's looked like for your school. So feel free to share that in the chat.
Yeah, so a couple of things from the chat. We have a living center that is not attached to our school, but is part of the school district. They have student leadership team, and certain students that are on the team receive training to be the go-to for students that are experiencing difficulties. Our staff at school and at the Living Center are all trauma informed. They're great. On the high school side, we know every student's name. That's over 100 students. We see them, we connect with them. Our staff live in the area, and some are Alaska Native, so kids see themselves here. Yeah. And then we do this with some of students. We unfortunately have too many to do this with all of them. And then the next one, as a non-Native and representative of white culture, I appreciate and value the guidance and peer support I receive from my Native colleagues. This is a critical element that aids me in being successful interacting with our Native students and families. Demonstrating good relationships and trust between us has helped me to be more effective and accepted as a trusted adult by our students and their families.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Peer support example for staff. Thank you so much. So how do we cultivate cultures of collaboration? How do we make mutuality happen? Maybe it's through shared understanding, shared respect, ensuring reciprocity. How do we make collaboration happen? Having a shared vision, having a shared action plan, having shared responsibilities, making sure everybody takes responsibility, shared decision-making, open communication, peaceful conflict resolution, just different examples of ways that we can cultivate cultures of collaboration. And feel free to continue to share in the chat your ideas of how we can cultivate these types of cultures within our schools. Because it's so easy for us to focus in on our own, our own little pods, our own little, our own rooms, or our own departments. And it's also easy for us to be hyper-focused on the partnership and collaboration that happens within our schools. So looking outward, examples of those that you're able to build those partnerships externally as well. So next is the empowerment, voice, and choice principle. Really is paired well with collaboration and mutuality, but also I think it's an important principle to point out separately as well. So with empowerment, whether it's with staff or students, it's really acknowledging that a lot of times in traumatic experiences, there's the loss of power. There's a person that doesn't feel like they have the power to change the situation, who feels helpless about what happened to them, feels like they didn't have control over the situation. And it's really giving them an opportunity to rebuild that sense of control and agency over themselves and over their environment. So as schools that are trauma informed, it's really important for us to set that as a high priority, ways that we can help empower and help restore some of that feeling of helplessness and hopelessness that individuals may have, whether it's students or our staff or even families. And it's really about individual experiences being acknowledged and validated. So we may not, from our outside perspective, see their experience as maybe being where we think that they were in a situation of being helpless or hopeless, but it's not really about what we think. It's that person's experience and really validating how they felt as they went through that experience, and really acknowledging that they even had that experience in the first place. And then it's also individual strengths that are recognized, valued, and built upon. So it's really continuing that idea that everyone has value, everyone has something to offer, And so we recognize that. We know that every single person has their strengths, even a person that may be acting within a survival mode, really have maladaptive behaviors. Those are survival skills that they learned. And so really seeing that their behaviors and their response to these situations as strength through a strength-based lens, recognizing that those are true skills, and that maybe they just need to be redirected in some cases, and that they're capable of learning new skills. So this is the last video I'm going to share with you guys. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up. Give me a second.
We know that student choice leads to increased engagement, but student choice is about more than just menu options. It's about empowerment. So here are 10 ways to empower your students with choice. Let students choose their own route. Let them decide which strategies they want to use. Let students choose the materials and the resources. Let students choose the topics or themes based upon what they geek out about. Let them ask questions based upon their own sense of wonder. Let students choose the format for their projects. Let them choose the scaffolding. If you provide the tutorials, they can decide when and how to use them. Let them work at their own pace. Let students engage in self-assessment. Let them choose the audience for their creative work. This could be local or global. Let students manage their projects, breaking down tasks and setting deadlines. A little nuance here. Teachers still need to make decisions. They have the expertise and wisdom that students need. But when teachers incorporate choice, students grow into the lifelong learners we know that they can be. If you're looking for more on student choice, visit spencerauthor.com/student choice and download the free ebook, Getting Started with Student Choice.
All right, what is your thoughts about that? Did some of those examples of offering choice to students and what it looks like, are those things that you already do in your classroom or in your school? Are there other examples that you can think of that weren't mentioned in the video? So feel free to put that in the chat while I pull up the slides. Any thoughts coming through, Sarah?
We have some that were already in the chat, and some that are typing right now. The most recent being, we really have to be careful of even comparing our situations and our trauma. Sometimes offering our experiences can appear to minimize their experience. Listening and offering support should always be our focus.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, we also had a comment about lots of invitations to non-threatening events, not just parent-teacher conferences, lots of fun things, as well as meetings where feedback's provided and real decisions are made.
Love that.
And never underestimate the skills and knowledge students have. Invite students to be the teacher.
Mhm. Love that. Thank you for sharing. Feel free to continue to share ways in which you offer choice to students, or maybe it's to staff or families. I'll go ahead and share one example. Restorative discipline. I was kind of hesitant to share this because there's so much to say about restorative discipline, but I felt like it was a good example of empowerment, voice, and choice. With punitive discipline, what that really looks like is just, imposing dominant culture norms and expectations, and focusing on identifying violation and establishing blame. And it's often the case that the administrator is the one that delivers punishment. And the result is often isolation and punishment, to really stop the behavior that's happening in the moment. So some of the examples of punitive discipline is scolding, berating, threatening, taking away privileges, suspension, and expulsion. The impact of this type of discipline is higher rates of vandalism, truancy, physical aggression, increased feelings of resentment, fear, shame, isolation, lowered self-esteem. And maybe it's not an internal motivation, but maybe to the student, it can come off as being motivated by the adult's anger, and it can come off as being motivated by a me against you sort of stance. But with restorative discipline, what this can look like is you're teaching what to do instead, not just stopping the behavior. You're teaching skills, you're setting limits, you're modeling, you're providing direct instruction, you're providing feedback, especially positive feedback. You're trusting the student to correct themselves. You're allowing for students to make a choice. You're giving them the space and time to make that choice. You're following through with consequences when necessary, and then you're starting those consequences out small or at a lower level before it builds up to bigger ones. You're using de-escalation practices. You're practicing reflective listening. You're validating and problem solving. So these are all the ways that restorative discipline looks like. But I think what's key here is that you're really centering those that you're serving, those that are impacted. And you're focused on repairing harm. And you're allowing for those that have been harmed and those that did the harming to have responsibility to choose how to make that right. So that's where the empowerment and the choice comes in. You're involving them in that process of discipline. And then you're reintegrating them into the community, and that's also empowering, that when somebody messes up, it's not a life sentence. They're able to come back into community and be restored. So those are just, and learning new skills is also very empowering as well. So those are just ways that it really came across to me that restorative discipline really helps to empower students, really gives them voice and choice, particularly in how to restore harm. So that's just one example of a practice that maybe that I thought about, but maybe there's others that you can think of, and feel free to share that in the chat. Other ways that we can empower, we can give voice and choice to those that we're serving, to our staff, to our families and community. So the last principle that I'm going to cover, it's really in that handout, the way that it's the SAMHSA handout, the way it's described is cultural, historical, and gender issues. But I really like to think of it as equity and social justice. It's when, as an organization, as a school, we prioritize equity and we prioritize issues of social justice. So oftentimes at the root of traumatic experiences, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination are occurring. So we see that happening in racism of today, but we also see that happening in historical trauma. We see that happening with sexism that occurs, just different ways in which there are there's stereotypes, there's prejudice, and there's discrimination. So healing comes when this occurs, when we address these issues within our schools. And we can do that in so many different ways, and there's all different ways that schools are doing this today. And so we can do this by dismantling oppressive systems. We can do it by decolonizing ways of doing business and the ways in which we teach and learn. We can do this when we purposefully help staff, students, and families heal from historical trauma, when we center Indigenous ways of knowing and being, when we safeguard tribal sovereignty, and when we really hone in and support the cultural identities of those that we're serving and those on staff and the families and communities that we're in. So it's really uplifting people's identities and affirming their identities. There's many ways, like I said, to do this, and feel free to drop in the chat some things that come to mind for you, ways in which we can address historical issues, cultural issues, gender issues, other types of issues of equity and social justice. So one example of a practice, what's really been on my heart and mind is really supporting the cultural identity of students. And one of those ways that we can do that is just helping them feel more connected to their culture, or to their community, or to the tribe they belong to. And so there's actually a practice that has been shown to have to be effective in increasing youth's feelings of being culturally connected, and that's peer youth mentoring program. So this happens in a situation where maybe the student, the young person, doesn't have direct access to their cultural community, maybe because of distance. They're not living in their homelands, they're not living surrounded by other tribal members. Or maybe it's a situation where they're not, a young person may not be showing interest yet in participating in cultural events and practices, even if they live in close proximity to their cultural community. So this is where, one young person, a tribal person, is paired with another tribal person, and they just provide that mentoring to each other and connection to each other and relationship building with one another. So that's just one practice that I've found, been really looking for examples of ways to increase students' feelings of cultural connection. And this is just one of those ways that, a student doesn't have to be engaging in cultural events or practices, but they can still feel connected, feel even more connected by this type of peer youth mentoring program. So how do you address cultural, historical, and gender issues that are traumatizing, that feel traumatic to staff, students, families, and communities? Is that something that, is there examples of your schools really tackling some of these issues and really showing success in tackling some of these issues? I'd love to hear some of that if you guys are willing to share.
Yeah, so the most recent shares are peer youth mentoring, excellent, especially, and then it moved, especially since the influence of peers is so important, valuable to them during adolescence. Next, yes, this is such wonderful work. Thank you. A practice we use is to invite students to share a photo important to them. They share and talk about whatever they like, land, place, special family member, etc. And it is a great way for them to gain trust in sharing their voice in class, and such a great way to build connections. Next, we started a GSA group, and that peer support is such a blessing. And then the last one we have in there right now is I have witnessed and experienced alongside my students the power of therapeutic art and creative expression. I'm a longtime poetry spoken word teacher or BIPOC Indigenous middle and high school student, or for BIPOC Indigenous middle and high school students. Writing as medicine is a transformative and powerful tool for youth who have experienced and or are exposed to trauma. And then another one just actually popped up. Being transparent, asking questions and advice, offering choices, having real discussions.
Yes, absolutely. I know one of the things that popped out to me as you were sharing about writing as a way for a student to really express themselves. You know, is there time that is being set aside within our schools, within the daily day-to-day of school, where students are given that chance to express themselves? We may not be directly addressing stereotypes in an overt way, bringing it up in discussion, but when we allow for students to really express who they are and share who they are, and we let them know that it's okay to be who they are and that they're accepted just for being who they are. You know, that can happen through the opportunities to express themselves. And that photo example, that's really awesome that they can bring a photo and just photo that kind of represents them and who they are, and being able to share that. That's a great example. You guys are doing some great work around that. That's awesome. So we do have a few more minutes. I want to give you guys a chance to drop in the chat any questions that popped up for you. And while you're doing that, while you're writing in your questions, I do want to give my contact information if you want to follow up with me. I also want to point you to another handout for this session, and it's our TTA offerings. It's a PDF of our training and technical assistance offerings. And we do have some offerings that are universal. So no matter what type of organization you are, there are some ways that we can support you in trauma-informed care. But there's also a section in that handout that really focuses on schools and trainings and technical assistance that we can offer to schools specifically. So I invite you to check that out if you want to learn more about trauma-informed care, if you want to bring any of this learning back to your school, you know, if you just want to have a conversation with me, I'm open to that as well. Did we get any questions before we close the session?
Yeah, we don't have any questions just yet. We did just have a number of thank yous that this was such a nice session. The handouts are amazing. They loved hearing the ideas and information. And then I do want to just give a little reminder to all the folks who are participating to please make sure and go to the polls tab before you leave to complete the feedback poll for this session. We would greatly appreciate you taking 15 seconds to do so. And I'll double check in case anyone has popped any questions in that I have missed. Yeah, the thanks just continue. So yeah, the session was well organized and paced, much appreciated. Many thanks. So I think everyone is all set for the day and they have a nice little break before they head into their final session.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining. I hope you guys enjoyed the rest of your day. Thank you guys for supporting the session as well, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Everyone, Veronica also has a session tomorrow on secondary traumatic stress and self-care. So feel free to join her again tomorrow afternoon.